What I want to do is I want to start with just a quick summary of what we did yesterday, so we have it in mind in a kind of a synthetic sort of way. What we did to start with was just to review some of the texts that I had shared with you as a kind of a preparation for the seminar. So there were 3 or 4 texts to look at. And I just wanted to point out some element from the text of Assmann on the Mosaic exception, if you remember. And then we looked at the text of Richard Rubinstein, who was a Jewish theologian from the post-Holocaust kind of movement. He was talking about the disenchantment of the world, and he was talking in particular, something which I thought was interesting, was this tension between the manifest values of a tradition and the ethos that is generated by those manifest values, saying there can be a very strong tension, even a contradiction, between the values that are manifested in a text or in a religious tradition and what happens with, in real life, what kind of reality does that create? So we looked a little bit at that. I mentioned briefly, I didn't have it on the screen, but I mentioned briefly a third text which was about a secondary reading on Levinas. He was from a scholar in the Netherlands, if you remember. And what he was pointing out is that from the writing of Levinas, there's another issue of violence, even though Levinas is considered to be really a philosophy of nonviolence in many ways because of the philosophy of the faith. But Levinas was saying essentially, first of all, there is the eruption of the faith of the other who suddenly appears in your life. You didn't want the other to be there. It would have been better if the other wasn't there. So there is this violence that is unsolicited. But at the same time, we as human beings, we have the ability, even though my temptation might be to make the other disappear because I didn't want him to be here, I also have, if I manage to get touched by the face, and Levinas in particular talks about the eyes in reality, I can manage to overcome that first violence and in a way to do violence to myself in order to overcome the violence of the other that comes and erupts in my life. So we saw a little bit of that. I then added 2 complementary readings to this very briefly. The first one was from Shaul Magid, an American scholar, contemporary American scholar, who was just reminding us that, in fact, for a long, long time, Judaism has lived in a post-monotheistic faith. And what I was pointing out was that the rabbinic tradition, so the tradition that was created by the rabbis after the destruction of the temple, kind of in sync or in opposition, but more or less in sync with the emergence of Christianity, that tradition was not monotheistic in the biblical sense. So the Mosaic exception on the danger of monotheism that Jan Assmann is pointing out actually doesn't have much reflection on Judaism. Judaism has never killed someone because they believe in another God. That's what the Bible says, but there's no rabbinic authority until the very present time, and that will lead to what we talked about at the end of yesterday. But at least in the classical rabbinic tradition, we've never had rabbinic authority saying that if you don't believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, then you should be put to death. So somehow we took that information from the text of Shaul Magid. And the last text I took as an introduction was the tractate, the commentary on tractate Makot from Levinas. So as you know, Levinas wrote books, philosophical books, Difficult Freedom, not Time in the Nation, but the other title elapsed me, but certainly Difficult Freedom is a very well-known book of Levinas on the philosophical ground. But Levinas also wrote Talmudic commentaries, okay, which are less well-known in philosophy's departments, but which are very well-known in the field of rabbinic studies, because Levinas is a great Talmudic commentator. And so I showed you an extract yesterday of the text of Levinas on the tractate Makot, in which we are confronted to a situation in which the vengeful God who wants the death of the one who doesn't believe in him says that he's going to cut short the life of the individual. The rabbis intervene and say, that might be well and good for God, but in our world, what we do is we have another way to intervene with people. A human court can inflict a certain punishment, and that prevents God from intervening. So you had here an example of how a certain human violence, which Levinas was really translating as there is no concern for the other if there is not at some stage a form of violence. The question is the measure of violence. But that human violence translates a concern for the other, and this is what prevents, from the rabbinic mind, this is what prevents the overwhelming God of Yan Asman to take over and bring his own punishment. So we discussed that. We didn't go into the detail of the text. There was no point. I just wanted to use that as an introduction. And then we moved to the first topic, and the first topic was the responsibility of the reader in front of violent text. And there are many violent texts, but I took one in particular, which one, the passage from the book of Joshua, chapter 8. I could have taken, as I said, any other chapter. We look at chapter 8, there were 2 points. One is the violence of the narrative. So the children of Israel go and slaughter. It's the time of the conquest. They slaughter as much as they can, basically. And the second part of the text, which was kind of more surprising, which was somehow this kind of the emergence of this utter religious hypocrisy, in the sense that suddenly they say they're going to build an altar with stones that have been untouched by iron tools, because of course we are not in the business of violence, even though they've just killed everybody in the city. So there was a kind of a moment of really typical, almost Isaiah denunciation of religious hypocrisy. And again, the same idea came back at the end. If you remember the end of the passage, the very end of chapter 8, in which we were reminded that there was not a word of what Moses has said that wasn't read and understood by the people who had just slaughtered everybody. And of course the conclusion is, well, again, I'm not sure what they've read of what Moses has sent, but anyhow, so that was an example that we saw that. And I concluded by making reference to this horrible book that I wanted you to be aware of, the Torah HaMelech, the Law of the King, which is a contemporary book by people who are using the book of Joshua in order to justify political actions today, and they make it as a kind of an halachic, so a legal framework saying, this is what Judaism commands. You are mandated to do that violence. And the reason I was showing that book with all the warnings that I gave you about that book, the reason I showed that book is because what it shows for me is if we don't deal with the book of Joshua because we don't like it, or because we feel uncomfortable with some of its message or most of its message, then other people are going to deal with the book. And they're going to make with the book whatever they want to make with the book. And my point was we have to be very careful with that, because at the end of the day, it's a hermeneutical war, and it's about convincing. It's about saying those are the books that we have in a religious tradition. They're part of the Bible. They're part of the Jewish Bible. They're part of the Christian Bible. People in different political contexts are going to use those books. And if there is nobody who bring a counter reading, then we're in trouble. So what I wanted to do now was, that's it for the summary. What I wanted to do now is to go back to the development of that idea and say, what kind of strategies of reading can we offer? And I want to point to 3. One is a kind of a theological strategy. The other one is more a legal strategy. And from the legal strategy will emerge a philosophical strategy of reading those books. So we'll look at that. But the first thing that we might want to mention and to have in mind is that there is a kind of an obvious way that we could look at those texts and say we should, in a way, disregard a lot of what is written. It's a kind of an historical, critical look on those texts. If you look at those texts and say those texts reflect beliefs, ideas, behavior of another time, and what was acceptable in the time of Joshua is not acceptable in our time, then if we look at the biblical text in a critical, historical way, then of course you can erase the majority of the problem. But why is that not sufficient? Maybe why is that not sufficient? Any thoughts?
It is a text that's recognized.
Yeah, exactly. It is a text that is recognized for what it is. It is a text that is accepted in the canon. We know that not all texts have been accepted in the canon. You have pseudepigraphy. You have extra-canonical material. You have material from the Dead Sea Scrolls who never made it to the canon. Yeah?
But also if we start by doing that, then other people would come and erase other things.
Exactly. And if you start to erase, you can start to erase a lot of things. You can start to erase everything that doesn't suit exactly what you want. And I would have to say, in addition to that, there's also the reality that the historical critical approach is not convincing for the people who don't want to be convinced by it. So, in other words, the people of the Torah Tameler, good luck if you go to them and you say, listen, the historical criticism of the biblical text can show you that this is only a reflection of what people believed in this time and so on and so forth, that it was redacted at such and such a time, that in reality, for historical reason, we know none of that ever happened. For them, this is the divine word no matter what. So unless we take it seriously as a text, which has its own authority that we accept as authority, then we are not engaged in her hermeneutical reading that provides an alternative way to look at those violent passages. So from that point of view, my approach has never been to follow the historical critical approach. I recognize the validity of it, but this is not something which here I think makes which is so necessary. So the first text we're going to look at now, in terms of kind of a theological approach to the text. Yes, please.
You don't use it because I think sometimes it can be very useful to understand in the context what it meant when it was written. Because they didn't ask the same questions, they didn't have the same problems that we have. So if I think this distance can help to understand, to get in touch with the text. I don't know.
Yeah, I think I'm hesitating whether I say I agree or I completely understand. I completely understand is a safer way for me to answer your question. I understand what you're saying. In a rabbinic perspective, you have to be schizophrenic in the sense that you have to be schizophrenic in the sense that I'm a rational being and I understand that the biblical narrative has emerged over centuries of literary creation, correction, and so on and so forth. And so therefore, everything has to be read in its context. And it's just impossible to just assume that everything is just a divine gift that came from above and it's just here in its entirety. At the same time, and this is why you need to be schizophrenic, is at the same time, the rabbinic tradition, all the texts that we're looking at are, sorry, this is just, no, this is nothing to panic. I've done that before, and it's going to come back. The rabbinic tradition works on the assumption that the text is perfect, that the text is of divine origin, and that everything in the text is exactly what it should be, and is there forever, and has a universal message that lasts forever. So you need to navigate between the two. My rabbinic identity tends to focus on the second aspect of it, in the sense that if I want to understand what the rabbis are trying to say, I have to take the text as it is presented to me, and not as the critical historical analysis can take it. I'll just give you a very short example, which is not here, but we know Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 have two stories of creation. The creation of the first, second story of creation. And of course, the historical schools have always pointed out the difference of language and the Yahavist and the Elohist kind of trends. And they say those are two trends in the story of creation, and they contradict each other because they were not written at the same time with people with different perspective and so on and so forth. The rabbinic answer to that by someone who was called the Rav Soloveitchik, who was the chief rabbi of Boston in the 60s, was that that's not the point. You're missing the point. If you think that there are two sources here, you're missing the point. He said, what you're not missing the point is if you recognize that there is a strong controversy and tension between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Those are not stories that are telling the same thing. They are in conflict. Okay? And he said the reason they are in conflict because we are in conflict. We are not homogeneous. We are torn between different parts of ourselves. There are parts of ourselves that are like Genesis 1. They are part of ourselves that like Genesis 2. It's not about two authors. Now, it's not that he's right over the others. He's not right over the other. He just takes the text as it is and he says, I don't go into the critical analysis text, but I'm making something of the contradiction between the two narratives. And that's kind of the spirit in which he works. That's why I said I understand the question, but at the same time I'm kind of resisting it, because I think to understand the text we look at, we need to resist the temptation to evacuate the difficulties by putting them in the historical context. Because as you were saying, if this is really what we would do, we would not have those texts in the biblical canon. We would have said a long time ago, let's remove those texts. And it's not just the book of Joshua. Passages, as we'll see, from the book of Deuteronomy, from the book of Samuel, there's so many passages that we would have to get rid of. So the text I want to, the first text I want to look at is from André Neher. I'll put it on the screen. And here is the thing, and it is this one, André Neher. All right, okay, so this is my translation. It might not be, it's a book in French, Regard sur une tradition, 1989. It's a bit of an old book, but it's a fascinating take on this text. I'll just make it a little bit bigger so you can follow better. Whoops, that's too much. Here it is. And here's what it takes. It requires a bit of careful reading. I would like to place the problem of the Canaanites, so the destruction of the Canaanites, in this current dimension, but by projecting this adjective into the biblical dimension of the event. Said, let's not be afraid to look at the problem in its current dimension, so in a way in its political dimension, though it's in the 80s, it's not in 2024, but still, in the 80s the problem was already there. But I want to keep it in the biblical dimension of the event as well. When the Hebrews prepared to attack the land of Canaan under the commandment of Moses and Joshua, they were not playing a one-sided role. There was no God then, any more than there is now, on one side dictating categorical orders, and on the other side, men recording this order to make it the code of their existence. It's a very interesting affirmation. It requires a very careful reading of the text. We looked at chapter 8 of Joshua and said this is an example of religious violence, and it clearly is. He says, there was no God then any more than there is now, okay? Which on one side is dictating categorical orders, mandate. He says, find me in the book of Joshua, find me the place where it actually says in explicit term, this is what you need to do. The book of Joshua is more ambiguous than it looks, in particular in comparison to what you find in other places of the Bible. I'm not saying that the book of Joshua is not a book of violence. It is a book of violence. But it is a book of violence in which it is not God on one side who tells you what to do, and you on the other side who just do what he says. That's not what you have. And the reason he's saying this is because if you compare, I'll come back to the passage here, comparing quotes, what is the command that animates the book of Joshua? You find in Deuteronomy something very explicit. When your God brings you to the land that you are about to enter and possess, and God dislodges many nations before you, the Hittite, the Girgashite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, the Jebusite, 7 nations much larger than you, and you, God, deliver them to you, and you defeat them, you must doom them to destruction, grant them no turn, give them no quarter. That is explicit, very explicit. But it's not in Joshua. It's in Deuteronomy. Same thing, Deuteronomy 20. In the town of the latter people, however, which your God is giving you as a heritage, you should not let a soul remain alive. That is explicit violence. This is the commandment of genocide, if you want. Okay? I use the term very carefully because this is the commandment of genocide. The rabbinic tradition has never done it. But the Torah has it. The Torah has it, okay? Now, no, you must prescribe them, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, the Jebusite, and your God has commanded you. 1 Samuel, again, thus says the Lord of hosts, I am exacting the penalty for what Amalek, which was the evil in the exodus of Egypt, did to Israel, for the assault he made upon them on the road on their way up from Egypt. Now go, attack Amalek, proscribe all that belongs to him, spare no one, but kill alike man, woman, infant, suckling, oxen, sheep, camels, asses, and you name it, okay? Now, that is explicit violence. There's just no question about this. Now, what André Nair is saying is, this, okay, is not about the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua is a book about what happened during the conquest as such. In a way, this is theory, and here's something's happening, what's happening. And if you look in the quotes of the book of Joshua, I put it in red, okay? I searched a quote in the book of Joshua where you have the kind of same mandate. What do you find? After the death of Moses, the servant of God, God said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' attendant, my servant Moses is dead. Prepare to cross the Jordan together with all the people into the land that I'm giving to the Israelites. Every spot on which your foot tread, I give to you as I promised Moses. Your territory shall extend from the wilderness of the Lebanon to the great river, the Euphrates, the whole Hittite country, and the whole thing. No one shall be able to resist you as long as you live. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you. It's tuned down dramatically. Okay? Nobody will be able to resist you. You don't have the Deuteronomy commandment that we saw before. Okay? So André Nair, when he writes, he said, this is not no more then than today. This is a God who is telling you to slaughter everybody. He said, when you actually look at the book of Joshua, you have to be a bit more careful because there is something that is tuned down. The question is, what do you do with it? Okay? The second quote, Joshua 8, which is what we read, do not be frightened or dismayed. Take all the combat troop with you. Go and march against the city. This is a commandment of war. This is not a commandment of slaughtering everybody. See, I will deliver the king of Hai, and his people, his city, and his land into your hand. You shall treat Ai and his king as you treated Jericho and its king. However, you may take the spoil of the cattle as booty to yourself. Now set an ambush against the city, which is what we read yesterday. Again, it's not particularly pleasant to read. I'm not arguing that. I'm just saying I am arguing this against the quotes from Deuteronomy. And the reason I'm doing this is because André Nair, when he writes at the beginning, this is not a God on one side who is dictating categorical orders, he's right. This is not what it's about. Now, let's see what he makes with it. On the fourth line, the character of biblical revelation is that of a covenant. So this is a theological answer he's going to give. A term that implies the simultaneous participation of two partners in common works, their ongoing cooperation with a view to events that will emerge unprecedented from this work carried out by the two. So what he's saying here is the book of Joshua is a book about the covenant. It's about how the covenant works. It's about the land, which is the place of the covenant, and all of that. In a covenant, you have two partners, and the two partners must be involved. The question is, what kind of partner are you? What kind of partner are you? In a relationship with God, what kind of partner we are? Servants. If you are servants, then you are waiting for God to give you a dictating categorical order, so as a servant you can perform. But are we servants? It's ambiguous. You have plenty of texts in the biblical, in the Psalms, in lots of places where we call Avdei Adonai, servant of the eternal. On the other side, you have a fundamental principle, which is the Exodus from Egypt, which is where everything starts, in which you refuse to be servants. So somehow, the question becomes a covenantal question. The violence of the book is going to depend, and the violence of a religion is going to depend on how we consider ourselves to be in a covenantal relationship. If I think I'm a servant, and I have to obey the orders, then indeed, the text is going to mandate Deuteronomy. Forget about the book of Joshua. The book of Deuteronomy and the book of Samuel are going to mandate extermination of the others. And as a servant, that's what I do. But the truth is, I'm not a servant. I don't want to be a servant. I don't want my relationship with God to be that of a servant. And if that's the case, what is my function when I have, in my mind, I have the memory of a mandate to kill? What is a non-servant do? What does a partner do? Where the partner comes and says, no, not that. That I don't do. God, you want to do that? Just do it yourself. Don't ask me. Okay? I'm not going to do for you. So the question is going to be, what sort of level in the covenant you pitch yourself? If you think you're a slave and God is above, then of course the Bible mandates violence, and you do violence, you behave as a slave from that point of view, and that's what you do. If your understanding of the covenant is that you're partners, which is what the rabbinic tradition has said, we'll see that a little bit later, then in that case, of course, the way you read the violence of the text is not that of being commanded. There's a mandate, but there is a double mandate. There's the mandate of what is commanded, and there is the mandate of what is it that you do as an equal partner. And that mandate requires, and this is what André Nair is about here. So if you look at the way he... Is that okay for everyone? Or?
But then God is violent because he asks for violence.
Not necessarily, because he might ask for you to react. So the question, and this is something we're going to see, I'm keeping the question for a little bit later in the day, but it's a fundamental question, Veronique, you're asking, because what we are tempted to think would be, well, if God doesn't want that, why doesn't he say it? Why not taking it as explicit? And the answer, the problem is, anything that's explicit creates, if you follow the explicit, the slave relationship. Whether what is explicitly said is wonderful, or whether what is explicitly said is horrendous. If you end up saying, I am behaving in accordance to what has been said explicitly, you will do it up to the point where it's explicit, and after that, you're full. And the question here is, therefore, there is a need in the rabbinic mind for a non-explicit understanding of what is written, which is a little bit what I was trying to explain to you yesterday when you asked this important question about the essence of the rabbinic tradition, of saying, this is why you need hermeneutics. You need hermeneutics because at the end of the day, you want to feel commanded, so you need a relationship with the text, but at the same time, you're not a slave. You're going to read it the way you want. And we'll see a story about that a little bit later. So let me just go back to the text. The problem of the Canaanites must be placed, I'll read the whole thing and then we'll discuss it, must be placed within the perspective of incompleteness. At each of the stages, the conquest was submitted to reflection, to a judgment, which could have, and which, without a doubt, should have, given it a different outcome. In other words, what Nair here is saying is, you take the whole of the book of Joshua, and I can't remember how many chapters, but it's sufficiently long, and the conquest of the land takes a lot of time. They do Jericho, they do Ai, they do all the cities. There's always a stop in between. One never follows the other. And Nair is trying to do something about this, say there's a temporality. The temporality would be here to think. There is, God said, let's do the plan, but the plan is not going into action immediately. There's a time. There's a time to think. You don't just react like this. The slaves react like this. You tell him do that, and he does that. The partner, you say, I think you should do that. You know what? Let me think for a minute. Okay, I just want to see what I have to say about that. So he said the timing of the book. There is a dynamic of time in the book that is, what's the word I'm looking for? That is intuitive, not intuitive. That is inductive. Of individual reflection, critical thinking. It's not the historical critical, but it's the ethical critical that we have here.
Talking about situational ethics.
Yes, we're talking about two partners discussing and saying that's the plan, and you have an obligation to respond. And what we're going to see after this text is if that is the case, what is the point of the book of Joshua? Yeah.
I think the problem could be that in this text we have another possibility of the result. For example, I'm thinking in Abraham's story when God said, "Do this," and Abraham try to do, and then not stop to. And here we have no that interpretation, what really want.
Yeah. I will come to the story of Abraham in a few minutes, and I'm glad you're pointing it out, because this is exactly part of this kind of ambiguity that we're talking about. I'll try, and I think that I was reminded of it because of your question of yesterday, as this is an easy example to understand what the rabbinic tradition does with the text. But you're perfectly right. In the story of Abraham, we have a kind of a similar take, because I could have taken an example of the violence of the binding of Isaac, for example. Yeah. So I'll come back to that. Yeah.
So when we have this picture of being, if we are servants, we have this hierarchy, let's say.
Yeah.
If we are partners, there is no hierarchy then. So if we are equals, then that doesn't mean we are kind of on the same level.
Yes, that's what it means. Yes, that's what it means. And this is where rabbinic Judaism becomes surprising, because to be perfectly honest, in the second moment of this seminar, which, because I like the discussion we're having, the second moment of the seminar is in a distant future. But in this second moment, the rabbinic tradition goes as far as saying, in the early stage of the covenant, God was the master, we were the slaves. Later on in rabbinic tradition, the image is not the master and the slave, it's husband and wife. That's the rabbinic image to talk about the covenant, so it's a covenant of equality. And in the modern era, after Auschwitz, the question of the covenant has inverted, is that we the senior partner in the covenant and God is not. So the rabbinic tradition is very audacious from that point of view. So yes, that's exactly what it means, is that there is a shift in the way our position within the covenant is, and that has an effect on such passages, obviously. Okay, so yeah. Now, if I carry on here, the Midrash, which is a kind of rabbinic literature from antiquity, provides ample enlightenment from this ouverture of the event. We see that the violence is constantly tempered and challenged by non-violence during the time of the book of Joshua. There's time of conquest, there's time of peace, there's time of conquest, so one follows the other. Thus, we discover an internal dynamism of the problem. It was never set into a dogmatic formula, a sort of imperative that categorically invites the Hebrew to exterminate the Canaanites. Quite the contrary. The problem is articulated throughout the story in the manner of a crisis, with setbacks, new developments, with its uneven and unforeseeable phases. Because the determined aspect of the problem is that at any given moment it was not clearly defined. The cause, far from being understood, demanded precisely that it be subjected unceasingly to the moral understanding of the individual. Okay? For the Hebrews, it was not a matter of executing a sentence, but of participating in a debate. That's what happened when you shift the covenant and the perspective on the covenant. In the matter of the Canaanites, God did not call upon the Jews so that they could be judges, but so that they could take up their role as partners in the covenant. Okay? Now, if that is the case, the question to a large degree is why is it there? Because they did slaughter the people. So why the book? Why that book? You know, if we follow the course of what André Nair is saying, why have that book in the canon? Why not having rejected that book and say, just like the book of Maccabees was not accepted in the Jewish canon, where the rabbis decided in the first few centuries of saying the book of Maccabees, which is also about wars and so on, we don't want that book. Why the book of Joshua? Why is it in the canon? Now, I think the answer to me, that's my reading of André Nair. To me, the answer here is the book is here as a testimony of what is the world if you think you're a slave. That's the testimony. This is what happened. If you miss the fact that you are a partner in the covenant with God, then this is where you end. This is what happens. And you need to see it in order to understand and to think a second time. Do I want a religion that creates the book of Joshua, or don't I want such a religion? But if I don't have the book of Joshua, where else would I understand what happened if I continue to be a slave in my relationship with God? An Eved Adonai, a slave of the eternal. So from that point of view, the book is a necessity. And the book has to be in the canon, because if it's not in the canon, you just don't get it. You can't be faced with the consequences of what you've done. So I think from that point of view, it's a really important kind of reading of the text that he offers. It's a theological reading of the text. It's close to the text because he looks at the dynamics, he looks at the time, he looks at the fact that the quotes are not so clearly, the mandate is not so clear in the book of Joshua. So he's a biblicist, André Nair. So he's a rabbinic biblical scholar as such, and a midrashist as well. So he's very close and he's very concerned with the text. He takes the text seriously and he works with the text in order to achieve what he wants to say. Is that okay for this passage? Yeah.
That means that something bad happened to Joshua. I totally don't know the whole story, but if Joshua didn't understand correctly the words of God, that means that this is not what he really wanted.
Right? The problem is, it's not the question of whether Joshua understood or not. It's the question whether or not the people understood. Because again, if you think either everything goes through what the Eternal has said, or either you think everything goes through what Joshua has said, you fall into the same problem. In other words, you've lost your responsibility. You're waiting for someone to tell you explicitly what to do. So the problem is not Joshua. The problem is us. And that's where the book becomes important. It's not them. It's us. That's what's at stake. Okay? So again, Joshua here is a figure that surely hasn't understood, agreed, but that's not the key topic, I would think. As long as we're waiting for someone to tell us what to do, whether it's God or whether it's the leader, we've already lost it. Okay, and this is what, in a way, I want to bring into the and I'll come at some stage. I can't remember where I wanted to do that, but it will come back somewhere in my notes, I suppose, on the second text, which is a little bit more of a legal halachic narrative, but which has a sort of a similar way of understanding what is our relationship to the law, okay, and in particular, of course, to those kinds of laws, okay. So let me turn to, I'm going to remove this one, and I'm going to remove this, and we're going to go to, so here it's a translation. I can also remove that probably. Yeah. Story of the Sages, this is, it's by Bialik, who was a very well-known Israeli poet at the turn of the century. And he compiled a book of Talmudic stories. Okay, and there is one in particular which I want us to read because I think it's very relevant to what we have. And it starts here at the very end of page 182, so here where you have the marking here. And I want us to read that because, again, it makes an interesting point. So it talks about someone who's called Ula bar Koshav, that's just his name. It's a context of war and it's a context of violence, again, because it's during the Roman conquest of the land. So if the book of Joshua is about the Jewish conquest of the land, now we're in a time when the Jews have lost their independence and it's the Romans, and the Romans are going to come and destroy everything and so on and so forth. But there's this guy, Ula ben Koshav, who was sold by the Roman governor. The man escaped and found refuge with a rabbi called Joshua ben Levi in the city of Lydia. Now, Lydia is today the city of Lod, okay, in center Israel. Then the Romans surrounded the city and declared, if you do not deliver up the man, we will destroy the entire city. It's sort of reminiscent a little bit of the Joshua kind of narrative, okay? They're surrounding the city, they're going to destroy the city. And therefore here there is an ethical sort of debate. What is Joshua ben Levi, the rabbi of the city, is supposed to do? Okay? So Joshua ben Levi went to Ula, who was sold by the Roman, and spoke with him, and he persuaded him that it is better for one man to die rather than the whole town be whipped out on his account. Okay? Agree or not?
It makes sense.
It makes some sort of sense, except if you're the poor guy, in which case it doesn't make sense, and except if you're innocent, in which it doesn't make either sense, and except that, in fact, it doesn't make sense in any case, because why should the individual suffer for the benefit of the majority, in particular when you're in the case with the Roman conquest, in which in any case they're gonna expel and kill everybody. So it makes sense and it doesn't make sense, okay? So what is this poor rabbi gonna do is what comes after. And he managed, I mean, it's implied, if you want, by the text, it's implied by the text that he manages to convince Ula, and Ula is delivered to the Romans, and the Roman kills Ula, and the rabbi has saved the city. Okay. What's interesting is what comes after. Now, the prophet Elijah used to appear regularly to Rabbi Joshua ben Levi. But after that incident, the prophet stopped visiting the rabbi. In desperation, Rabbi Joshua fasted for 30 days, after which Elijah appeared again. So the rabbi used to have the visit of the prophet in his dream, and after this story, nothing. So he fasts, and he fasts for 30 days, and after 30 days, the prophet appears again, and the first question he asks is, why did you stop coming? What did I do not to deserve your visits? And the prophet Elijah answers, am I a friend of informers? Am I a friend of people who have delivered innocent people to the occupying power? And Rabbi Joshua ben Levi has this surprising and scary answer. I only did what the law allows me to do. So why are you coming to me? What kind of argument you're coming to say, am I a friend of informer? This is a ridiculous argument. I only did what the halakha tells me that I'm supposed to do. I'm the rabbi of the city. You put me in front of an impossible problem, Okay? And the choice is not good. It's violence either way. I consulted the Jewish law, and in the Jewish law, I found out that there is a passage that says, if there is a city that is surrounded by an army, and the army is asking for the life of someone unless they're going to kill everybody else, you are allowed to deliver that individual. That's the law. I've done what the law requires me, and you're telling me that this is why you're not coming to visit me? And amazing answer of Prophet Elijah, true. But the job could have been carried out by someone else, not by you. In other words, what the story really is about is, who are you? Remember, we had this question in terms of the covenant. Who are you? Who are we in the covenant? Are we slave in the covenant, in which case we're going to do what we think God dictates, and we're going to do the mandate. And that we fall on the biblical violence immediately, the book of Deuteronomy, the book of Joshua as a testimony. Okay? Or we have a certain expectation of ourselves. And that expectation of ourselves is, I don't really care what the law says. I'm not happy with the law. The law is not satisfactory. The law could have been carried out by anyone else, not by you. You are above. You have a higher understanding. You're not a rabbi for nothing. You're supposed to be a leader of some sort. You're supposed to think. You're supposed not to hide behind the law. But if you hide behind the law, you're just switching one violence for the other. So what we have here, which I think is very interesting, is we have a case, if you want, where in front of this absence of acceptable choices, there is no real acceptable choices here. What is it that the rabbinic tradition really mandates? The rabbinic tradition does not mandate that you follow the law. It mandates that you go above. So it's something that we call in the rabbinic tradition, lifnim mishurat hadin, beyond the requirement of the law. Okay? It's an obligation. It's not just an ethical dream to say, okay, it's an obligation to go beyond the requirement of the law if you have any pretension of being someone with something to say. And the point here, which for me is really important, is the big issue, if you want, is if we think that we're going to escape the biblical violence because we're looking for something that is explicit, because this is what the law tells us, then we are doomed to fail. Nothing can be explicit. And I think this is what people have great difficulty to understand. The biblical text is full of contradiction. Love your neighbor, and the quotes from Deuteronomy, kill everybody. Okay? Is it better, I'll put it in very harsh terms, is it better to say, I have a law that tells me kill everybody, and I follow that law? Or I have a law that tells me love everybody, and I pretend that I also follow that law? We're tempted to answer the second one is better. The rabbinic tradition said they both lead to the same violence. At the end, they both lead to the same violence. Because what you're missing in this, which is the only way to escape the violence, be it biblical or political or so on, is if the individual has a sense of responsibility. And if the individual has a sense of responsibility, he cannot be satisfied, or she cannot be satisfied by this is what is written. Even if what is written is love your neighbor as yourself. And remember, this is the tension that Rubinstein was pointing out when we looked at the second text of the introduction, when he was talking about the explicit values and the ethos created by those values. Okay? The Christian tradition is a very good example of that in history. The Christian tradition has talked about the love of the neighbor and forgiveness over and over again. And yet, of course, we as Jews, we were the first victims. For 20 centuries, we were the first victims of violence against us committed in that name. It's not for nothing that there was a Second Vatican Council and there was Nostra Aetate 60 years ago. Okay? So this is not me saying that about Christianity. This is the Vatican saying that about Christianity. Okay? This is not me. This is Vatican document. This is Vatican doctrine. Okay? So the explicit values carry the risk of, by being explicit, they take away the responsibility of the individual. The Bible and the rabbinic tradition do not do that. They refuse the explicit. And they said, I don't care about what's explicit and what's not explicit. What I'm interested is what is the responsibility of the individual in front of the situation. That doesn't make us more successful. That's the sad part, is that you would think, or we would have liked to think somehow, that maybe the rabbinic tradition in its way of trying to emphasize either the partnership in the covenant or the responsibility of the individual in front of political situation, real political situation. And here I'm talking contemporary, because for us Jews, the only political situation we know is the state of Israel, because we don't have power anywhere else. We never had power anywhere else. So there was a kind of an expectation that somehow maybe we've learned something from history, and maybe we can manage differently. And maybe all the rabbinic reflection can lead to something different. The end result is we're back in the book of Joshua. That somehow we haven't done better than Christianity has done. Okay, and maybe that's what brings us together at the end of the day, is that somehow in front of history, in front of politics, none of us is so brilliant in those situations. But you see here, you have that kind of legal aspect of how the covenant here translates in legal terms, of saying, as long as you think that I've only done what the law permits me to do, you're back into the failure of the exercise. Okay, so that was for this little Talmudic text. Is that okay for everyone? Okay, and let me just. Why is there an error now? Oh yeah, I know there's an error because I'm not connected to the internet. Hold on. Wi-Fi. This is a problem if I'm not connected because I can't get my documents. Okay, should come back. Okay, let me turn off the Wi-Fi and then back on. Yeah, should be back. And here, and sorry for that technology. I'm not sweating. I'm not completely panicking, which I'm kind of very happy already with this. Here and here and here we have it. Okay, right. So I'm now going to use that text in order to spin on the text of Levinas, which says something very similar. It's a little bit of a polemical text. It's a polemical text done in a spirit of self-criticism, which in a way is the exercise that I do, because by looking, as I've done yesterday and today, at rabbinic text about violence, biblical text about violence, the failure that I evoked, there is something that is self-critical. The self-criticism is not just aimed at the Jewish side of the equation, but there is also a little bit of a criticism here of some aspect of Christianity that comes out from those texts, and this is what I want to look at with the next passage, which is the text from Levinas. So this is from Difficult Freedom. So this is different than the kind of text we looked yesterday, which was the Talmudic reading. Okay, so this is here a more philosophical text, and I'm interested in the passage that starts here when on the third line you see it talks about the extermination of the Canaanites. Okay, now the point is this. The extermination of the Canaanite people, is it large enough? You can read here? So the extermination of the Canaanite people during the conquest of the Promised Land is the most indigestible passage of all indigestible passage of the Bible. Okay? It's not, actually, because the one in Deuteronomy that we look is even worse. Okay? But nevertheless, it's a nasty piece. The texts vainly insist on the evil committed by the Canaanites. You can blame the Canaanites as much as you want, of saying they were evil people, like we blame Amalek from being evil people. It doesn't take away that when the book of Deuteronomy says you have to kill the children, the wives, the elderly, and so on, it doesn't make it any better. Okay? So Levinas is not a fool. Okay? He understands that. It is vain to extrapolate the very idea of perverted and irreparable civilization, contaminating those who pardon them, which have to disappear for a new humanity to begin. Simone Weil is revolted by such a cruelty. Obviously, the philosopher, not the other Simone Weil. It is vain, to a large degree, to believe that this is such a contaminated society that it actually has to disappear. Now, it is vain, and it is not always so vain. And I'm not taking here a contemporary example, but I'm taking 20th century example. The fight against Nazism is not vain, at least not for me. Okay? So, are there moments, and Levinas rarely talks about this, in fact, but are there moments in which there is a political reality that creates in itself a mandate for violence, is something that we have known in the 20th century. The only risk with that is if you think that this is not exceptional and you can apply that to any political situation. And the temptation to say, well, if it was true then, it's true today, and it's true with this one and with that one, and so on and so forth. And of course, I'm not doing that on any account. But I just want to somehow remain or keep a critical eye with the text of Levinas, because I don't think the fight against Nazism was so vain in itself. Okay. Simone Weil is revolted by that cruelty of the biblical text and so on. The extraordinary thing is that we agree with her. Levinas is usually in total disagreement with Simone Weil, and this is what he's going to talk about. But here he says, I agree with her. She's right. Okay? The extraordinary thing is that the Jewish consciousness, formed precisely through contact with this harsh morality, with its obligation and sanctions, has learned to have an absolute horror of blood, while the doctrine of non-violence has not stemmed the natural course towards violence displayed by the whole world over the last 2,000 years. And here he's having a dig at Christianity. He said, we Jews, the so-called doctrine of violence that Simone Weil is talking about, of saying, you in the Hebrew Bible, the God of vengeance, the God of Deuteronomy, the God that wants to be killed, and so on. Levinas say, and Levinas here talks outside of the political context of any political contemporary situation, obviously. But he says, yeah, maybe that's what we have, but we've never done blood things. And he says, I turn the mirror to you. Okay, so Simone Weil, who converted to Christianity, okay, I turn the mirror to you and say, you have kind of removed those things and you have talked about love and so on, and yet, of course, for 2,000 years, the church has massacred Jewish populations. That's an easy dig, because it's historical. There's almost nothing I can say. What's more interesting is what you do with it, okay? And this is where I think he becomes interesting. The harsh law of the Old Testament is perhaps not a doctrine based on kindness, but what does it matter if it is a school of kindness? It's not Yeah, sorry, let me just move that a little bit so you have it in the middle, okay? So the harsh law of the Old Testament, including the law that commands genocide that we've seen. And I'm not using the words lightly. Including that law is not a law of kindness, but what does it matter if it's a school of kindness? If because of the way I read the story, I manage to make the story say something else that it says, or I find a way to say, I never do that. Okay? I give you an example which I think will explicit the question of yesterday. There is another passage I could have taken about violence, which is, it's called Ben Socher Umore, the rebellious son. So it's at the end of Deuteronomy. I don't know, anyone is familiar with the rebellious son? No. The rebellious son is this. If you have a rebellious son who rebels against the voice of his mother and his father, the mother and the father have to take the son to the high priest at the gate of the city, and they have to bring the son to the priest, and they have to say to the priest, this is our son who is rebelling against her. He doesn't listen to our voice. And the priest should take the stones and kill him with lapidation. It's our beautiful Bible. Okay? We love it. What does the rabbinic tradition says? Okay, it's written, that's true. This is not kindness. How can it become a school of kindness? So they look at the text and they say, okay, they have a son, so not a daughter. So if it's a girl, she's not part of the deal. That's not the case. Okay? She doesn't listen to our voice. He doesn't listen to our voice. In the singular. Lo shomea bakol. He doesn't listen to the kol, the voice in the singular. So the rabbis say, the voice of the father and the mother in the singular mean that they have the same voice. So if they have the same voice, it means they have always said the same thing. So any family in which the husband and the wives have had disagreement excluded from the law. And then they said they have to bring, in their steps, they have to bring, I can't remember every detail of the text, but they have to bring the child to the gate where the priest is, so they have to walk there. They have to walk, it says, with the same steps, so they have to have the same physical posture. The husband and the wife have to walk exactly in sync. They have to have the same length, the same this and that. Everybody has a difference between the husband and the wife. It's out of the thing. So they take every bit of the text, right? And that's where you have the hermeneutics. It's related to the text, but what they do is they turn the thing upside down and they said, okay, yes, I really want to follow the law. I wish I could stone my son because he's a rebellious son, but sadly I can't because it doesn't fit. It's not, right? So this is what Levinas means when he talks about the harsh law of the New Testament. The harsh law of the Old Testament is perhaps not a doctrine of kindness, but what does it matter if it is at the end of the day a school of kindness? What is it that has generated from the text a rabbinic consciousness which makes the rabbi do that exercise about the text I've just mentioned? It's somehow because there is a deep, deep understanding, and you remember the picture I drew yesterday about the matrix of all the consonants and so on, that the text somehow is not explicit and is not meant to be explicit. So if the text is not meant to be explicit, who am I? I am a responsible reader who needs to find in the text what is it that I want to find in the text. And that put forward the responsibility of the universe. And this is what Levinas really is trying to talk about. So he goes on. Let me just see if I haven't missed anything here. Yeah, I'll come back to one more thing later. He goes on and he says, we agree with her, blah, blah, blah. Okay, it is not a question of justifying it by its success, but it is probably in the nature spirit that an austere God and a free man prepares a human order which is better than an infinite goodness for a bad man. The question is, maybe the God of the Old Testament, as Simone Weil was saying, is an awful God, but he's an awful God who has prepared a free man. Is that less dangerous than an infinite God of goodness who has not prepared the free man? So it's kind of the question that he's asking. He's getting polemical, you can sense in the text, very polemical. Only a God who maintains the principle of the law can in practice tone down its severity and use the oral law to go beyond the inescapable harshness of Scripture. It's because I take the law seriously that I need to explicit its details, that I'm going to have to look at the details of the text to see what the law is. And when I do this exercise, I end up never falling into the trap of the rebellious son. I end up never falling into the trap of the commandment of genocide of Deuteronomy 20 that we've read, because I go through the details of the text, because I take the law seriously, and I understand it's not explicit, so I'm going to have to work it. I'm going to have to go into the hermeneutics of the text, and with that hermeneutics comes my freedom. I'm a free man in front of a text that is not explicit, and what is it that I do with that text? Okay, so this is really what he is about. And here, just to shift back the focus on criticism of Judaism, now let's just do that on what comes after that. The notion of oral teaching, so it's the oral law that corrects the written law, that softens to a degree the written law by making it more humane, more in tune with the responsibility of the individual. The notion of oral teaching is not the vagueness of a tradition that is added to written teaching or is anterior to it or simply abolishes it. Oral law is eternally contemporary with the written. You always have to be involved orally with the written law. Your responsibility with the law never stops. It's not because the rabbis have written the biblical, the rabbinic text we saw earlier about Ula bar Koshav and Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi that the story is finished. The story is about you and the text. And today we have different problems with the text. For example, we would probably have a problem going back to the rebellious son. We would probably say, what is this idea of saying a son and not a daughter? I can find other examples in the Bible where son means daughter. Because today I feel there is a sense of equality, so therefore I want to include the gender sort of approach or equality to the thing. And I would not be able to follow the reasoning of the rabbi who said, first you exclude the woman out of that picture. Now, it's done for a great purpose, of course, in the rabbinic narrative. But today you would still find yourself as a responsible reader in front of the word son. And say, okay, I might have a problem here, there, and so on. And what do I do? You'll need to develop your own hermeneutics of the text. So it's an ongoing thing. But what is remarkable is this. There exists between them an original relation whose intellection resembles what comes after, the very atmosphere of Judaism. The one neither maintain nor destroy the other, the written and the oral, but makes it practicable and readable. To penetrate daily into this dimension and maintain itself within it is the famous study of Torah, the famous lernen. Okay, he's using kind of a Yiddish term, which occupies a central place in Jewish religious life. Or if you like, it is the Pharisaism of which the gospel have given such an odious image. The major misunderstanding between Simone Weil and the Bible consists not in having ignored the text of the Talmud, but in not having suspected their true dimension. Okay? Now, where I said I want to go back to a criticism of the Jewish tradition now is about this. Yes, the famous ability to learn, the famous ability to come to terms with a difficult text in a courageous way, this is what has characterized Judaism. My question is that true today? And you remember the text of the Torah HaMelech that we wrote yesterday? The Torah HaMelech collapsed, completely avoid entirely the problematic of the rabbinic tradition, and the Torah HaMelech takes the biblical text, takes the modern contemporary situation, and collide the two together. So in other words, the learner that was what made Judaism be what it is, I am not sure it still exists. I am not sure it still exists. And that is terrifying. That is terrifying. Because what it means is we don't have an oral law anymore. We don't have an oral law that can mediate between Torah and human freedom and reality. And an Israeli thinker who died many years ago now was called Yeshayahu Leibovich. And if you have any chance of reading a text of Yeshayahu Leibovich, the guy was a kind of an absolute prophetic voice. He wrote in 1967, at the time of the Six-Day War, he already saw, and he was a lonely voice, completely lonely voice, he saw what would be the political consequences in Israel about the question of the occupation. And he was an adamant, ultra-Orthodox, but adamant against any form of occupation. And he saw that, today there are plenty of people who think like this, but at the time, he wrote, he was a harsh guy, a little bit like the harshness of the text of the Torah, but somehow there was something in him, and I recommend all of his reading. But he said, the problem of Judaism today is that the oral tradition has become a new Torah. The oral tradition that had this flexibility, today it just has become another written text. So people say, oh, it's written. And they stop thinking, and they said, this is why everything's happening. So the question of the violence has to be really looked into that context. I just want to show you one thing about this this question that is really here central, is this fundamental ambiguity of the text. And I said earlier, if you don't have the ambiguity, whether it's beautiful or horrible, it's the same result. Okay? Because if I'm told you shouldn't do that, I'm also going to find a way of saying you shouldn't do that in the that is that, but when it's outside of the that, I'm still going to do it, right? So it's the same kind of problem. But I want to show you, I hope I can do that. I'm on the internet, it should work. I want to turn to Genesis 22. And by the way, if you are interested, this website, it's called sepharia.org, okay? Sepharia.org is a very, very useful website for any sort of rabbinic research. It has it has the biblical text, but if I look, so I click here on any verse, and it gives you all sorts of stuff and cross-reference. You can see where you find it in the Talmud, in the Midrash. You have 142 commentaries to that text, all sorts of things that you can find. So it's a very useful tool. This is the story that I can't remember. I think it's you mentioned. Sorry, I don't know your name. Yeah, the story of Abraham, Genesis 22. Okay? And Abraham, sometime afterward, God put Abraham to the test, saying to him, Abraham, and he answered, here I am. That's where God is going to ask Abraham to sacrifice the son. It's an example of, obviously, human violence. Okay? We read the story. I think everybody knows the story here. We don't need to go over it. But we read the story, and the question is, okay, what kind of God is that who asked Abraham to prove his faith by killing his son? And because Abraham agreed to do it, then God was satisfied, and okay, even though it doesn't happen at the end. The way it works here, and this is where hermeneutics is useful, is when it's... when it's not here, so and it said, "Vayomer kachna et mincha, take your son, et yechidecha, your only son, asher afta, the one that you love." And the rabbinic tradition say, well, it's a strange formulation because after he say et Yitzchak, then take Isaac. So why doesn't he say take Isaac? Okay, he said because in fact it's a dialogue already. The Eternal said, "Take your son," and Abraham said, "Oh, I have more than one. Which one?" Okay, so God said, the one that's unique. So they're both unique. Okay, the one that you love. I love them both. Okay, you want me to say it? I'm going to say it, Isaac. Okay, so there's this dimension of question, answer, responsibility that we've talked about. But the main point is this. and go, lech lecha el eretz Moriah, go to the land of Moriah. And here, normally when you read the text, and offer him as a burnt offering. Okay? The problem is, this is not what the Hebrew says. Ve'alehu sham lehola means bring him up there as something that you bring up. Okay? Bring him up there as something that you bring up. Which, if you read it in the context of Leviticus, in which it talks about the sacrifices are also called olah, something that you bring up. But in the context of Genesis, that's not necessarily what the word means. Okay? So the question here is, what is it that God is asking Abraham to do? What is God asking Abraham to do? Is he asking Abraham to sacrifice his son? Or is he asking Abraham to bring Isaac up? For something else. Okay? The story is kind of interesting because it's also the failure of Abraham. Abraham, for some reason, felt that maybe this is what he needs to do. And what is interesting here is how come Abraham thought that God wanted him to sacrifice his son, while in reality, this is not necessarily what is in the text. So there is what God said, and there is what we think that God says. Just like when we read the text of the critique of Jan Assmann about the monotheistic exception, and we read the text of Shaul Magid, he talks about monotheism, biblical monotheism, at least what we think biblical monotheism is. So there's always this discrepancy here that is between what we think happens, what we think God says, and the fundamental ambiguity of God's language. And here you have a prime example which is of extreme relevance for monotheistic faith because it's the story of Abraham, it's the beginning of the narrative. And if we think that monotheism is about this violence against the son because this is what God wants, then somehow I think we've missed the point. The fundamental message of the monotheistic faith is that God can only speak in ambiguous language. And then it depends on us. What is it that we understand? So I just wanted to add this example to the text here. If I can just return maybe, so hold on, it should be here. He has, I just want to be fair, I just want to read just the end of the text of Levinas, and then we will turn to the second part of what I want to do in those 3 days. He here has something a little bit difficult on Christianity, but to a certain degree, I think it does help to understand what he has in mind. I would suggest we read just maybe the last paragraph here. Does divine goodness consist in treating man with an infinite pity that lies within this supernatural compassion that moves Simon Weil, or in admitting him into his society and treating him with respect? To love one's neighbor can mean already to glimpse his misery and rottenness. But it can also mean to see his face, so you recognize here the terminology of what we saw yesterday, his mastery over us, and the dignity he has as someone who is associated with God and has rights over us. God's supernatural love in Simon Weil's Christianity, if it goes beyond a compassion, so careful here at the end, if it goes beyond a compassion for creatures' misery, can signify only love of evil itself. There is a moment where infinite compassion can also create love of evil, because it's compassionate, because it's the infinite compassion that becomes problematic. God loved evil, that would then be the conclusion. This is perhaps, we say it with infinite respect, the most fearful vision of this Christianity and the whole metaphysics of the passion. But our respect is mingled with a strong sense of dread. Our past lies elsewhere. So just in the same way that Levinas was hinting, at least through my reading, of saying we have to be careful because everything that the rabbinic tradition, the learned tradition today, I'm not so sure it still exists, and therefore Judaism is a very dangerous path if it has lost that. There is also a possibility of a dangerous path for Christianity, is that an infinite compassion has also implication for violence. So I thought it's only fair to kind of share the burden of how wrong we can be, all of us. Okay, so is that okay? So the responsibility of the reader was really, for me, what links those texts together, and hopefully it makes us think a little bit on all of that. Let me just turn to the second topic that I want to definitely start today, and here it is. The second topic, which is a bit of an offshoot of the first one, is the question of you should have no other God but me, which is something that we saw in the introduction. And at the same time, the love that we have for religious freedom. You know, we talk about religious freedom, we pride ourselves of considering that this is an important value that somehow we try to cherish. But the Mosaic exception seems to contradict that vision. Judaism today, nothing to do with the Mosaic exception of the biblical time, but Judaism today also finds it very difficult to deal with religious freedom. I was once in contact with a Buddhist, a guy who was born a Jew but who converted to Buddhism. He was the head of the Belgium Buddhist union, not union, but association, I suppose. And he said, you're the only rabbi that's ever talked to me, because nobody wants to talk to me. Because, you know, we're not considered to be a monotheistic faith for the rabbinic tradition because of images, because of this, because of that. And he said, nobody ever talks to me. So he said, I don't understand why you talk to me. Okay. But, you know, so we have that, we have internal difficulty with religious freedom. I'm not an Orthodox rabbi, okay? Many Orthodox rabbis won't talk to me because they say, well, you're not Orthodox. And many non-Orthodox rabbis won't talk to Orthodox rabbi because they say, you're radical. I don't talk to you. Christianity is much in advance on that score because, of course, you have inner dialogue between the different, this ecumenist, strong work that is done. And from that point of view, the Christian tradition is maybe more in tune a little bit, within limits, I suppose, to this kind of possibility of religious freedom within parameters. But it's not so easy for anyone. Okay, it's a topic that is difficult. So what I want to do is I want to start with a few biblical quotes that kind of puts the tension in focus as to do we really have a problem with religious freedom? And if we do, which I believe we do, what is the path where we can overcome it? Where is the way, where is the place, both in history and in the biblical narrative, when we can overcome this resistance that we have towards religious freedom by trying to impose violently, this is my way and that is the only way. Okay, so I just need to change the folder, and that should, normally this is organized, and I'm just going to open a few, no, hold on, let me first of all get rid of the old ones. Okay, Micha. And then we're going to take Exodus, and then we're going to take Isaiah, and I'll bring the rest after. So I'm going to start with Exodus. I'm going to follow the order. So this is, of course, a very well-known text. We've seen it before. This is from the Ten Commandments. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You'll notice, of course, that the first of the Ten Commandments is the commandments for freedom. This is not for nothing that the Ten Commandments start with the Exodus from Egypt. But most important to our purpose is you should have no other God but me. Okay, which is really what we read from the start. It's a harsh sort of God that is presented. If you look a little bit down on verse 4 and 5, you should not bow down to those idols, nor serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquities of the fathers upon the children, and to the third and fourth generation, them that hate me, and so on and so forth. This God who doesn't accept any sort of other view of worship, not only doesn't accept for you, but also doesn't accept it for those who have done nothing, the generation that comes after, which is a little bit strange. Fortunately, we have a correction to that in the prophetic text in Ezekiel. Okay, Ezekiel 18:20. I'll take it here if I manage to do that. Genesis. I don't want Genesis. Okay, it's going to be here. No, it's going to be here. Tanakh. So that's the Bible. And I want to go to Ezekiel. And I said 20:18, correct? No, 18:20, sorry. 18:20, and you have it here. Only the person who sins shall die. You know, the correction of Ezekiel to the text of Exodus, which is interesting because what it means is that, and this is what I wanted to use that, is that you have here, while the text of the Torah, the revealed text, the Word of God, has its own violence. And I said that the rabbinic tradition was very often correcting that violence. I gave the example of the rebellious son. Here, in an anticipatory way, the prophets came before the rabbis, of course, but the prophet here corrects the text. Okay? Only the person who sins shall die. A child should not share the burden of the parent's guilt. So the rabbinic way of contradicting and softening and amending the biblical text has an echo in the biblical text itself, but at least in the prophetic side. The problem for the rabbis, why don't they speak like this? Because they're not prophets. They're not prophets anymore. So they have to use their brain. They have to use the hermeneutics in order to achieve their goal of saying, the text says, but this is not what it means, while the prophet speaks in a more direct sort of way with the limitation of a direct speech, as I mentioned earlier. But anyhow, so we have this first text, and then we have the second text that I wanted to put in parallel to help us think about it, is the text of the prophet Micha. So another prophetic text, hold on, let me try to make that bigger, which is also a very well-known passage in the prophetic literature. I'll just read it. But in the ends of days, it shall come to pass. So are we talking about now, or are we talking about in the end of days? And in which situation do we believe we should posture ourselves when we want to think about overcoming Exodus 20? Okay? In the end of days, it shall come to pass that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established as the top of the mountain, and it shall be exalted above the hills, and people should flow unto it. And many nations shall go and say, Come you, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, and to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and he will walk in his path. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he shall judge between many people, and he shall decide concerning mighty nations afar off, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, that we know, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither should they learn war anymore. So it's the prophetic vision. But they shall sit, that's the passage I'm interested in, and they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid. Where am I? I've lost it. and not to make them afraid. Sorry. For the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken, for let all the people walk, each one in the name of its God, but we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. So I'm contrasting Exodus with this. Okay? And we don't have so many quotes that seem to offer no one shall be afraid, everybody can go and walk with his gods, and everybody is his own vine tree, everybody has his own ways, and we live in a happy time. Okay? So the question I have about this, and I just want to use that as a kind of an introduction, is, again, is the quote of Micha a correction to the quote of Exodus to a certain degree, just as the quote of Ezekiel could be seen as a correction to the second part of Exodus 20, verse 5 and 6? Or is it here simply a temporal issue? There's a tension between the present, which would be Exodus 20. So we live in the present, and in that present, there is no religious freedom, and we're living under this kind of violent yoke of the text of the Bible. But we are allowed to dream that we could live in Messianic time, but what are the consequences, the pros and cons of believing that we are in one time or the other? And when I know what Messianic Judaism does today, I'm very suspicious of the benefit of thinking that we live in Messianic times. And when I say Messianic Judaism today, I'm not talking about Jews for Jesus or anything like this. I'm talking about the political context in Israel. The national religious movements, the settlers and all of that, are Messianic. They think that the state of Israel is the beginning of redemption and this is the beginning of the Messianic time. And this generates an incredible violence because somehow, I think what happens when you do the Messianic time and you bring the Messianic time into the present, Christianity has that problematic too, but they manage it in a different way. What happened is everything becomes ahistorical. Yeah, ahistorical. So you take everything from the realm of history, because in front of the Messianic era, the contingencies of the real life, the contingencies of history becomes irrelevant. Therefore, you can do whatever you want. Okay, and this is exactly what happened politically in Israel today. So that's why, or in some fringes of the Israeli society today, that's why somehow there's something here that puts me a little bit unease of saying I'm a bit disturbed to a certain degree with the idea that we could be thinking because of our desire for religious freedom that we think that brings us to Messianic time. And so I'm not going to use that quote as such for what follows, but I just wanted to bring that into the discussion.
I wanted to ask you about Messianic times.
Yeah.
I mean, is it in a way planned by God?
Or not?
What
Yeah.
Yes. After what you have said of the covenant, so...
Yeah. Okay. So there's a whole series of messianic readings done by Levinas, which you can look at. They're very good on this. He has a whole section of how he reads this messianic text. But essentially, there is a Talmudic debate about, is messianic time something that arrives no matter what? So it's planned by God, and it's just a question of being at the right place and the right time. Or is it something that is dependent on human action? And so this is a known Talmudic tension between the two. The problem of the first one is that while it ensures human responsibility in trying to bring the Messianic era, it also brings the possibility that you never succeed. So in terms of hope, you have a problem with the second one. You don't have that problem with the first one, which is the view that Messianic time will happen no matter what, okay? But it takes away the sense of responsibility, because if it happens no matter what, then what do I need to do? And I think the question of the war of Gog and Magog in the kind of more apocalyptic sort of literature is also about that, of saying that if you really believe that God has planned for the Messianic time to arrive at any particular moment, even any sort of upheaval doesn't matter, because no matter what, it's going to happen. So the question of this Messianic time has huge political implication in the contemporary life of Judaism, and it has and in the world. But it has, from the foundation of Zionism, the question of Messianic time was there, because if you remember, at the beginning of the Zionist enterprise in the end of the 19th century, religious Jews were completely against Zionism, because the point was the return of the land is a Messianic reality and only God brings the Messiah, not Herzl, not David Ben-Gurion, not people who are secular. Okay, so it's only God who brings and it took a lot of time for the Messianic idea to sort of find some sort of shape in the contemporary landscape of Judaism, and it remains a very debated issue. But I'm always very worried about an emphasis on Messianism on the Jewish side. I mean, this is really something that that makes me kind of uncomfortable with the idea. But yes, I mean, but that tension exists, and it just relates certainly to what we were saying about the sense of the responsibility of the individual. Yeah, I'm just trying to think how else to answer your question, but there's a Leibovich, which I mentioned earlier, was saying, he said the phrase in Hebrew to talk about the coming of the Messiah is Mashiach Yavo. The Messiah will come. And he says the Messiah will come. It's the expectation that's important, not the coming of the Messiah. So as long as and he goes very far, because he was very polemical against Christianity. And I remember, I can see the interview, I have in my head the picture of him, this man who's 98, and he say, Mashiach Yavo, he say, Yavo, he will come. Any Messiah that comes, Mashiach Sheker, is a false Messiah. A Messiah that arrives is a false Messiah. The only true Messiah is the one that will come, and it will always come, but only always tomorrow. Okay, so so the Messianic is the expectation and not the arrival of the Messiah, which is maybe a way to reconcile a little bit what we can do, because what do we do between today and tomorrow? That's kind of where the responsibility comes back in. But I don't want to stay longer on this quote, but the one quote that I'm going to use into what comes next, which we'll do, of course, tomorrow, is a quote from Isaiah, okay, which I think provides the ground in a way that is not going to be explicit today, but I think will be tomorrow. It provides the ground where we can think in maybe a little bit more, with a little bit more of a calm, rather than we had with the Micha quotes, where we can think about where is the place in which this possibility of religious freedom can find its place in Judaism. So here's the passage. Let me just get it here on my computer as well. It's reloading. Here it is. So we don't need to read the whole of the passage from Isaiah, but maybe we can read just. Maybe we can read how much did I put? That's the only question I have here. I only put one page. Right. So, in any case, let's read from verse 14. Thus says the Lord, the labor of Egypt and the merchandise of Ethiopia and of the Sabaean men of stature shall come over unto thee and shall be thine. They shall go after you, and chained they shall come over, and they shall fall down unto you, and they shall make supplication unto you. Surely God is in you, and there is none else. So it's interesting because we have here the echo of Exodus 20, which the prophet Isaiah doesn't remove. Okay, but then he said, there is no other God. Okay, truly, okay, verily, you are a God that hide himself, O God of Israel, the Savior. And I'm interested in that particular quote. Why? Why do you think that quote is possibly interesting? In verse 15, Achen ata el mistater. Indeed, you are a hiding God. The God, Elohei Israel, the God of Israel, Moshiach, the Savior.
It's like someone trying to capture the sun and can't capture God.
Yeah, you can't. There is something about this where you can't capture. Okay? There is, yes, there's no other God, okay. But you are a hiding God. And what is it that you're going to be able to put into this hiddenness? At the same time, this hiddenness is also the God that saves. How a God that is hidden can save is a difficult one, okay? And it might be more difficult for Christianity than for Judaism. Because in Christianity, with incarnation, you have almost the opposite of the hiding God. You have a God who is revealed, who is extremely revealed, who saves because he's revealed. How Christianity comes to term with the quote of Isaiah is a difficult question, which we will see a little bit later tomorrow, because I do want to bring into the discussion some text from the Christian tradition, not the Catholic tradition, but from the Christian tradition about that. But this idea of the hidden God seems to me to be something that is kind of promising in trying to see where is it in that otherwise rather violent tradition of saying there's only one God but me and everybody else would be slaughtered. That this is an entry point which I think is interesting. And the way I want to do that is I want to look at two different aspects of the problematic. The first one is a legal aspect, and I have time to start this morning, a legal aspect through a Talmudic story. It's a very bizarre Talmudic story, but it's an interesting one because it points to the Talmudic possibility of a God who is removed and hidden and who therefore permits the plurality of understanding and interpretations. Okay? So it's a sort of a removal of an overwhelming presence of the divine that would prevent to have a religious freedom as such. So I'm going to start with this, and then we'll look at two contemporary Jewish texts on this very issue, and then two Christian texts as well on this issue, which I will now start with the first one, which I will put on the screen, and it's about an oven. So don't be fooled by the rabbinic methodology. The Talmud always talks about things that people know, because there is this idea that theology starts with things that I can touch and think about, and that from that precise example, some sort of message comes out. So here it's called the oven of Achnai, which is the name of someone. So it's about an oven, okay, to cook bread, okay. And the question is, the question is the following: is, you know that in the Jewish year you have, food-wise, it's always a little bit complicated, but during Pesach, which is Passover, you can't have any leaven. It's called the chametz. You're not allowed to have any leaven. That's why we eat only matzah, which is a kind of a flat bread with no leaven, and it's a reminding of the story of the Exodus and so on. The question is, because you have to remove any trace of leaven, can you have the same oven for every day and for the time of the festival? Because in an everyday oven, I'm going to bake some bread and they're going to be leaven. So normally you say, no, you can't. you need 2 ovens, and you need 2 sets of dishes, and 2 sets of cutlery, and 2 sets of everything, 2 sinks, and 2 fridge, and 2 everything, because everything has to be separated. Okay. So there is a debate about this particular oven whose Achnai has invented, and it's an oven that you can dismantle brick by brick. So when the festival of Pesach arrives, you take off all the bricks, and you can clean in between the bricks and everything, and then you can put it back together. And he claims that this is okay for Pesach. So you can also use it for Pesach now that you've dismantled the oven and rebuild the oven. It's what we call an halachic question. Is this oven kosher or not kosher? That's the question, okay? And he says the following: the rabbis were discussing the case of the oven of Achnai, an oven whose section, Véronique, do I have to stop at 11 dot, or can I do 11:02 or 11:03? Because if I have to stop at 11 on the dot, I might as well do the story tomorrow.
I don't think somebody's...
Do you want this? Actually, listen, it's a plot to make you come back tomorrow. Okay, that's what it is, you know. So the story, I'll tell you the story and we'll read it tomorrow. The rabbis are discussing this oven. And there is one voice, Rabbi Eliezer, who said that this oven, because of the way it's done, can be used for Pesach as well because it has been properly cleaned. And the other sages said no, even though it's a revolutionary way of doing this oven, it doesn't work. And Rabbi Eliezer tried to bring argument to support his case, okay? And the assembly of the sages do not believe him. So he gets very upset. And he says, listen, you don't listen to me, but maybe you listen to God. I'm going to ask God to intervene in my favor. If I'm right, you see the river is going to flow backwards. So people go and look at the river, and the river stops and flow backwards. And Rabbi Eliezer says, see, I'm right. And the sages says, no, it's a miracle. It's a great miracle, and we don't know how it happened, but that proves nothing about the oven. So he said, okay, so let me take, you see this tree? Okay, the tree is going to uproot itself, walk 300 yards, and replant itself. They look, the tree uproots itself, walk, replant itself. And same argument, I'm right. And the rabbi said, no, this is another miracle, but this proves nothing about the oven. And at the end of an argument, Rabbi Eliezer said, listen, we're sitting in the same study hall. If I'm right and you don't listen to me, may the walls of this hall collapse on you. And the wall starts to move. And there's a rabbi, another one, Rabbi Yoshua, who was among the opponent, who stands up. And he says, he points the finger at God and he said, listen, God, you have given us the Torah. The fact of whether the oven is kosher or not has nothing to do with you. Leave us alone. You have given the Torah to us. The Torah is not in heaven anymore. It is for us to decide. It is not for you. And the story says the walls stopped halfway. They stopped halfway by respect for Rabbi Eliezer, who was right, but they didn't collapse for respect of the other rabbis who were right, because the Torah is not in heaven. And the interesting part of the story is, one, what comes after that we will do tomorrow, but essentially the reason I'm mentioning this is because the problem here is it is only a God who accepts to be in hiding, somehow removed, even though God intervenes in this story, but that is somehow removed, who says, the Torah, lo bashamayim hi. The Torah is not in heaven anymore. You have given us the Bible, you have given us the Torah. To a certain degree, you have an obligation to be removed. And in that el mistater, this kind of hiding God that is somehow to a certain degree removed, okay, is there not here the possibility, through the walls that haven't collapsed but haven't gone back straight, that there is a recognition of the plurality? There is a recognition that this one is right, and this one is right. And the story ends with this very interesting passage, and I'll just finish with that. Sometime after, the prophet says to God, God, what were you doing when the sages were talking in this story? And he says, I was laughing and I was saying, my children have defeated me. My children have defeated me. So this removed God, this hidden God, takes pleasure of being defeated. Takes pleasure of having people making decisions that are not what he thought of at the beginning. But they do it with sufficient touch, with sufficient subtlety, that this God says, I was laughing to see my children debating and disagreeing in such a way. And in this, I see some sort of opening to our question, okay, of that. And this is where we'll start up again tomorrow. Okay? Right. Thank you very much, everyone.